In today's show, the most common personality type that you'll encounter for your proposal or presentation. Welcome to Bullet Points, the show that takes the mystery out of what makes proposals persuasive. I'm your host, ChrisSant. As we discussed last time, jury research shows that the most important determinant for how jurors make decisions is the evidence. And the same is true in your proposal or sales presentation. The evidence you use matters. So, how do people actually evaluate evidence? Last time we talked about the 4 classifications of what's called need for cognition, which is a person's willingness to consider and engage with complex topics. This gives you a way to think systematically about what it will actually take to win the deal.
I'll tell them what we're hearing.
Last time we talked about high drive, high ability folks called scrutinizers. One of the great joys of my job is getting to work with and train folks like these, because it's refreshing and invigorating to be able to bounce ideas off someone and work together to build something great for a client.
This is invigorating. We should have done this sooner.
But the reality is that people are constantly shifting back and forth into the low drive state. When we're tired, or we don't think what's being discussed concerns us, or we think our opinions don't matter, as well as back and forth into the low ability state, like when we're distracted by a new email or a knock on the door or a phone call, or we don't understand some jargon that someone used. Nonetheless, there are some people who tend to reside in those other boxes. They are a regular part of juries across the country, and they will absolutely be a part of your selection committee. So we need to know how to win them over as well. People who are low in drive but high in ability are the ones that we call security guards. This is because they basically stand around. They're usually bored.
I guess the 8-hour day can be boring, and I'll try to organize my day and think of what I'm going to do that night, or, meditating, prayer.
But they will spring into action if it's absolutely required. Security guards are the most common personality type that you'll encounter in most large company sales and proposal activities. And this is actually because while a lot of people at those levels would normally be both high drive and high ability, they are so busy and overwhelmed and oftentimes frustrated by the bureaucracy that they function as a high ability, low drive security guard, stretched so thin that all they can do is just try to prevent harm from occurring. Whereas research shows that scrutinizers are active participants in a discussion and carry a lot of influence, security guards tend to be passive. Yet at the same time as they're being passive, they are judging.
You're the biggest liar I've ever met.
So if you thought people were always judging you, you were right.
Your case is dismissed for perjury.
They skim down your proposal. They're keeping a sort of scorecard of how much sense your proposal makes.
That doesn't make sense.
Okay, then we'll move on.
If you've ever heard someone say something like, well, I didn't calculate the numbers myself, but what you're saying makes sense, that's a security guard at work. As I mentioned, scrutinizers tend to jump to a conclusion early on, and this is often called the primacy bias, where the first thing you hear becomes what you believe. By contrast, security guards tend to display what's called the recency bias. That means that whatever they heard last is what they'll tend to support. So while a scrutinizer is more likely to prefer one of the first 1 or 2 proposals that they see.
Vicky sweeps into the market. Let's watch her shopping style. I guess it's called steer with your body, as long as you get where you want to go. And Vicky wants to go for our big, expensive cuts of beef.
The security guard is more likely to support one of the final 1 or 2 proposals that they see.
There's less than 10 seconds left, and Liz is fighting for every giant block of cheese she can wrap her hands around.
The reason the security guard displays the recency bias is because this person is also more likely to have skeptical thoughts about whatever they're reading. This is probably a defense mechanism because skepticism allows them to justify not engaging more actively. They can always just fall back on an excuse like, oh, I don't trust any of them.
Never trust a woman in platform sandals.
That's an easy move.
Don't trust anybody who takes pictures of themselves crying.
It lets them stay passive.
Never trust a woman with rough feet. Don't trust a guy with soft feet.
Well, there's 2 things you can do to win security guards over. First, like the others, they will listen to and follow scrutinizers. So you need to arm the scrutinizers on your selection committee with clear, specific, easily understood, easily remembered points in your favor. Second, as jury research shows, evidence does matter. Now remember, for scrutinizers, we want to use siege evidence. This is where you support the same point from multiple angles with different types of evidence. Your evidence for a scrutinizer is supposed to cut off the cognitive escape routes. For security guards, it's a little different. They're lazy and they're skeptical, but they are paying attention. For them, you want to make sure that you deploy your main points with wedge evidence, whereas siege evidence is designed to go wide to cover all potential sources of escape. Wedge evidence is designed to go deep to counteract the security guard's passive skepticism. The risk with a security guard is that you'll present solid evidence and they won't even engage with it. Instead, they'll shrug and say something like, well, everybody can find some statistics showing that they're the best. This is why, for your most critical points, you want to present a wedge of evidence, just like a wedge of cheese. The goal is that no matter how the security guard slices the evidence, you're still the best. So with a client that runs testing for pharmaceutical companies, we presented a wedge of evidence showing our ability to run their asthma medicine clinical trial faster than competitors. And the way we did it was, we said, well, whether the trial is asthma pediatric asthma using complicated devices, or pediatric asthma using complicated devices with detailed imaging, we're always between 14 and 18% faster than industry averages. So what we're doing is we're saying, even if the security guard wants to dismiss one or several of those slices of evidence as being irrelevant, eventually they have to concede that all the evidence is pointing in the same direction. We are going to be about 15% faster than anyone else. And that time savings in getting a drug to market, in this case, was worth about $74 million. Same thing with an engineering client. They were writing a proposal to a customer who wanted flexibility, using whatever type of crude oil was the cheapest at the time. They wanted to be able to buy their oil on the spot market. So the wedge of evidence showed that whether their crude was heavy or light, high in sulfur or low in sulfur, our refinery design was always going to produce between 4 and 6% more gasoline, which for them meant approximately an additional $115 million in revenue per year. And keep in mind, these folks are cognitively lazy. You do need to connect the dots for them. Tell them exactly how much revenue they'll make. Do not expect security guards to calculate the numbers themselves. They won't. Remember though, most people do want to make the right decision. So if you give the security guard evidence in the way he wants it, he'll muster up the energy to support you. He'll become an active advocate for you. Unfortunately, far from spurring passive security guards to become active scrutinizers, most proposals actually push scrutinizers to becoming passive security guards. One of the biggest ways they do this is with overly complicated language. They use complicated, long words and synonyms where short, simple, everyday words would do just fine. Utilize instead of use. Facilitate instead of help. Proficiencies instead of skills. You get the idea. Or I suppose the proposition and action points have been comprehended by you, or something like that. The point is, complex language is not a problem because a scrutinizer can't understand each individual big word. They can't. They are high in ability. They probably have a perfectly good vocabulary. The problem is that you're killing the scrutinizer's drive. The more pointlessly complex words you encounter in a row, the less motivated you are to keep going. It's not hard to understand why. If the writer couldn't put forth the effort to write clearly, why should you put forth the effort to slog through it? So you're actually pushing them from being a scrutinizer to being a security guard. And as we'll see in the next video, what happens is that you end up sounding like a striver, who is a low ability, high drive person. And interestingly, security guards don't like the baloney of strivers, just as strivers don't like the low energy of security guards. Besides the use of wedge evidence, which makes use of the fact that security guards are high in ability, the way to persuade security guards is to not look the same as everyone else. This is taking advantage of the fact that they are low in drive, so they're looking for shortcuts. So give them one. Instead of being the 12th proposal in a row that they see that's nothing more than black text on a white background, include color and visuals and white space and headings and useful formatting. That alone will get their attention. In other words, the goal is to be so much more professional and clean than everybody else that there's really no comparison. Primacy and recency biases, they only have an effect if you're dealing with many proposals that are roughly similar. If one far and away stands out, these biases aren't nearly as important. They'll treat your proposal or your sales presentation as being separate. I've seen this happen. I've actually been with a client who was listening to pitches, and one of them stood out just like I'm talking about. Afterwards, one of the directors literally turned to the group and said, "Well, we have company X and we have everyone else. Thoughts?" Guess who they chose? Scrutinizers and security guards are why you need to insist that claims be specific and not vague. Why you need to back up your assertions with evidence. Scrutinizers and security guards are also why it's so important to start strong, so that the very first impression you make is positive, and why it's equally important to finish strong with a confident call to action, so that the final impression is persuasive. Join us next time when we find out the easy ways to persuade the low ability people. Until then, I wish you much success.
Never trust anybody wearing Skechers. Don't trust stinky people.